Sorry about the end to that previous video. That was really abrupt. I kind of lost track of how many slides were on the deck, and yeah, so it was like I hit one. I thought I was going to come on to this one, but I already moved this one into the second video. And that'll make sense because it's actually a little bit of a change of theme here. But I was talking about Goffman's idea of presentation of self in everyday life, and I really want to build that in this second video now, so you have a very comprehensive overview of this critically important topic, because really I don't think there's many projects that get done in this module which can't use Goffman and can't reflect on Goffman's work. So just to build up more on Goffman, I'm actually going to go back to Anthony Giddens very shortly, and then I'll get back into Goffman after that. So in Modernity and Self-Identity in 1991, Anthony Giddens outlines a framework to understand the role of identity in modern society. And despite the fact that this is written sort of pre the popularization of digital media, and certainly pre-social media, I think this is very useful for us to know. So for Giddens, social structures and human agency are connected, as we saw in lecture 1, with the former being reproduced by the latter through the repetition of certain actions. So in the setting of modernity, the altered self has to be explored and constructed as part of a reflexive process of connecting personal and social change. So our very practices of understanding ourself are always embedded in the social practices around us, is what Goffman is saying. And therefore, our practices of doing selfies are an exploration of the self, but they're also embedded in this wider social context of social media. So self-identity is therefore a person's own reflective understanding of their own biography, and an ongoing project that we're constantly modifying, updating, safeguarding, and so on. And it's that idea of the ongoing project that I think is important for us in terms of understanding selfies. Selfies are part of a biography that we have. Now, they fit as a kind of social action in Giddens' first instantiation here. You know, the altered self is explored and constructed by our practices, but also the practices of self-identity are a biographical element of what we do, and the selfie therefore, and our practices of sharing selfies and also storing them, and indeed reflecting on them on our Instagram account or whatever we have, are part of an ongoing process of self-identity, according to Eugenie Ziapara. So for Giddens, this self is consequently tantamount to a kind of project or a work of art, if you want to borrow from Michel Foucault. Identity is accordingly seen as being in a perpetual beta phase, to use new media terms, which Ziapara does brilliantly there. Never quite complete, but instead always in the process of becoming. So the selfie is very important in this sense of becoming, always. We are always reflecting on our own self-image. We're always changing, adjusting, and so on. And in doing that, we are engaged in this process of constructing ourself always. So the selfie plays an important role in self-construction and the construction of self-identity and self-presentation. So in terms of self-identity then, a person's identity can thus be found within their capacity to keep a particular narrative going, and that emphasis is in the original work, which I've cited there. This is accomplished through the construction of a biography that details the self in a fashion that makes sense to me and you as a person, to us as individuals. So our biography makes sense, it's consistent. As this is the case, the materials used to construct and present our various identities, as well as the circumstances under which this construction takes place, acquire an increased significance. What we're getting at here is that the selfie is so important in this process. This is why it's significant to us and our use of social media. The last point is really important in context of the Facebook age. As social networks arrive with their own imagined affordances, what we can do with them, that have implications for identity formation. They are mediating our identity formation, and to a certain extent they are shaping our identity formation, and they reflect, you know, our identity formation practices therefore reflect the tools that we have, for very McLuhanist point, and are shaped by the tools that we have with us. So in terms of self-presentation, social networks afford new ways for people to curate, present, and perform who they understand themselves as being. So our self-identity is curated, presented, and performed constantly over social networks. And one of the most important ways we do this is visually through the practice of selfies. Suggestion here is that identity itself is a performance played out through various platforms. And this echoes entirely Goffman's understanding of the self, as explained in the absolutely classic text in Sociology, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Because for Goffman, all interactions that we have are performances in which individuals are attempting to present themselves in a particular light. Not always perfect light, but always in a particular light, in a particular manner. Identity is the outcome of enactments in which the actors provide an impression of ourselves. And therefore, what we do on social media in general, but particularly what we do with selfies and visual presentation of ourselves and self-representation, is always a performance which is there to present ourselves in a particular light. So going back to cat stuff again, network self-representation has transformed from effortful, static, but under our own control, which is sort of pre-social media, early homepages, into dynamic, multi-platform and aggregated, but dependent on pre-given templates, social media. So images, status updates, but also by people's friends, their check-ins and other data traces function as social cues, which build up our identity to ourselves and to others. Visual aids help us express emotions in textual communication. This makes visuals that are not necessarily of us usable as a part of self-representation. Networked visual objects like GIFs and memes allow us to express ourselves with less effort and more nuance. They're strategically useful forms of communication. What Kat is getting at here is that all forms of visual communication are now very important in the construction and presentation of the self and the understanding of self-identity in others, so how others construct identities of us. All of these visual forms of communication are very important in doing. So, as with the majority of performance, an audience is required, right? So, to borrow from Goffman directly here, when an individual plays the part, he or she implicitly requests his observers to take, or her observers to take seriously the impression that is fostered before them. They're asked to believe that the character they see actually possesses the attributes they appear to possess, that the tasks that he performs will have the consequences that are implicitly claimed for it, and that in general matters are what they appear to be. What is Goffman telling us here? We are always engaged in this form of self-presentation, and we are always engaged in this kind of performance, and our aim is always a rhetorical aim, to convince. It is to convince our audience that this is an authentic performance of our self-identity. We are engaged in these constant performance-related arguments that we make to others, that this is us. We are being genuine at this point in time. And therefore, what we do on social media, and particularly how we present ourselves visually on social media, becomes a very important aspect of that form of performance. So taking the metaphor of the stage further, and Goffman is very keen on this idea of the front and back stage. Goffman argues that identity can readily be divided between front, and back regions of social interaction, with each with its own schema. That schema is like a set of mental shortcuts and corresponding subject position. The front regions are the performance witnessed by the spectator, if you like, the image. The presentation of self on social media. In stark contrast, the back regions are where performance can relax and step out of character. These spaces where action occurs related to the performance but are inconsistent with the appearance fostered by the performance. If you like, the backstage is the us. We are not on at that point in time. We are not doing the performance. We are, stepping away from these things. Now, what I think I'd like you guys to reflect upon is, does social media collapse these two stages together? If we spend inordinate amounts of time on social media and we catalogue our lives to such an extent using social media, are we collapsing down the barrier between front and backstage? And indeed, all we're left with is front stage. That would be very, very dangerous for us as human beings in terms of our understanding of self and the idea that we have a reflective self-understanding. If everything's a performance, then we take into account what we do on these platforms and it becomes dominant. So it is something worth thinking about. So, but to go back to the selfie in this thing, identity then is not a passive activity. Okay, it is always an activity, and it was always an active activity. It is an active process as a result of various life choices, and which manifest themselves in myriad ways. So identity can be interpreted as a performance which people use any number of front regions to present themselves, an idealized version of themselves to others, social media included. In the digital age, one significant stage of these performances, of course, is on social media through the selfie. Because remember, we always choose how we take the image, what filter we use, what angle, what text we anchor it with, who it's shared with, and how it's shared. And this is all part of our construction of self-identity. Selfie is an expression and part of identity, therefore encompasses both front and back stages in Goffman's view of the presentation of the self. And this is what I'm saying about this collapse of things. The digital object, the selfie, has all of these things encoded in it. And you might want to reflect on how different platforms have different selfies. What you share on Facebook as a selfie, even if you use Facebook, is going to be different to what you share on Instagram. It's going to be different to what you share on Snapchat. You know, so even the platform itself has very different practices. And I'm going to get into this more in the seminar about this lecture, but you know, it's definitely worth something thinking about. So, in terms of selfies as a photograph, even after it became widely accepted that photos can be altered and carry multiple meanings, we're still inclined to interpret them as documents of something that is unarguably there. So, but in terms of technological changes, you know, in the past decades, we've increased the number of photos, in particular snapshots, have made photos meaningful in streams, and have given photos more communicative and interactive meanings. So people do read a lot into images and the meaning of images, and each photo can have multiple social functions, which we can, to an extent, we can control, like when we delete an unpopular image or make a loved one our profile picture. So we are always using images to construct meaning and to construct meaning for others, really with those who are viewing these meanings for us. And so therefore there's a hugely dynamic process going on here in identity formation, management, curation, and it all takes place within this visual culture that we have fostered by social media in general, and which we're fully engaged in. And therefore, the photographic form is incredibly important here. We might want to reflect on, therefore, how we selfie. That's very, very important. If you're going to look at your practices of self-presentation in terms of the project that you're doing, how you do it is incredibly important. Now, up above me is how not to selfie. Okay, this has got to be one of the most notorious selfies ever taken, you know, selfie in the Auschwitz concentration camp. And that's exactly where it is. And look at her face. Some of you may have been to Auschwitz. Some of you, I'm sure all of you have heard of Auschwitz. And, you know, to sit smiling, stand smiling, you know, in front of, you know, the blocks there in Birkenau, and then, you know, send that, and that's shared on Twitter, no less. Oh my God. This is how not to selfie. A selfie is this is like the worst selfie performance of all time, all right? So if the selfie is a performance, it's got to be performed in a certain way. All performances are performed in particular ways. That's not a question with a definitive answer, but it's definitely something you should think about individually and about others. We can broadly define selfies into the socially acceptable and the socially unacceptable, and those very elements of socially acceptable and socially unacceptable are defined largely on social media, and we learn them. We learn them through exposure. I mean, this is clearly socially unacceptable, right? And, you know, even a fool must know that. But there are far more nuanced performances than this clown going, you know, which we learn through our exposure to and the reactions to, and sort of our embeddedness within this culture itself. So what Kat means by selfie practices is how we do selfies. So the myriad things people do, say, think and feel to create, share, attribute meaning to, and understand and interact around them. So selfie practices in that sense include posing, editing, posting, saving, sending, deleting, hashtagging, commenting, captioning, liking, and reposting. These are all practices we engage in regularly when we take selfies ourselves. You may want to, and you know, it's important to reflect not just on that aspect of preparing oneself physically for the selfie, but also all these other processes and go on. How are you going to label it? How are you going to hashtag it? You know, how are you going to ascribe meaning to it through those things? How are you going to share it, and what time are you going to share it? You know, because that is actually an important aspect too. Who are you sharing it with? Who do you know is going to be around and online at that point in time? Who do you want to see it? You know, there's an audience, both imagined and actual, for our selfie performances. So in terms of understanding our selfie practices and our self-presentation practices on social media in general, we need to understand what activities are involved, what things are used, and what are the relevant context. And what can we learn from an unacceptable selfie, like the Auschwitz selfie? And what can we learn from them? How can we avoid doing those things? So, I mean, Kat Tiedenberg's diagram here is, you know, our performance, we think, we interact, we feel, we express, we do work, and that contributes to our becoming and belonging in particular ways. Selfie practices have social functions. You know, here the importance is on what is being done, what is the intention, and what is being felt. And the practice of performing underpins thinking, interacting, expressing, and working with our selfies to construct our self-identity and image to others. So it's a very informed sort of process that we go through. It can, you know, people can dismiss this and think, you know, it's just an image that's been taken really quickly. That doesn't cover really what's happening. So how do we selfie? We think of it as, you know, we can think of doing selfies as self-presentation, tools we think with, as interactions, as a way to feel about ourselves, and as labor or work of a particular kind. You can watch this video on it, and indeed I've got some projects from last year which reflect on this process as well, which are up on Canvas, and I think they'll be really useful for you guys. So why do selfies matter? Well, selfies are incredibly complex, obviously. You know, these two videos should tell you now that selfies are a very complex, multifaceted object which, you know, really plays an important role in both self-identity and self-presentation. They can make us feel bad and be an expression of feeling bad. Selfies can convey a sense of authenticity or can be perceived as fake. They can be high quality or low quality, and that's really important because selfies carry and are used as a way of accruing social capital, borrowing from Pierre Bourdieu, and therefore the perception of quality is critical. And I don't just mean quality of the image, I mean how the image has been staged. What does that say about us as a person? What kind of social capital do we derive from this? Selfies are at the base of a moral panic, but most importantly, selfies can make us feel good about themselves. A good selfie shared well and liked by loads of people can be really important. Now, I'll get on to why that might be problematic next week as well, but in the context of this, I'm quite willing to accept that selfies have a really positive function for us if they're done well, and if we're happy. Now, something quite weird happened with my video then. I don't really know what happened, so I'm back on it, don't worry. So why do selfies matter? Well, according to Kat, based on how selfies make us feel, it becomes evident how culturally overburdened they are, which in turn lends them their power to make us feel anything at all. It's a self-reinforcing cycle of expectations, norms, behaviors, and reactions. They can make us feel bad when people judge them as narcissistic, that they lack authenticity, they have no artistic merit. They make us feel good when they make us feel seen as positively valued, and when and how we want to be seen, when we create them in a particular way which is positive. So there's both good and bad in the selfie itself, and it's really a positional thing about how we consider them. And I mean, in terms of their importance, again, drawing on Kat's work, and you look at the little figure diagram here, see, you know, when I am seen, it's how and when I want to be seen and as positively valued. That's great. That's a very, very positive aspect of using the selfie. So selfies can be very important in developing a sense of ownership of ourselves and our self-identity and our presentation of ourselves, and a self-efficacy over our own identities. And exercising that kind of agency is so important psychologically, and it's critically important in modern life. We can feel seen, we can be positively valued, and we can control how we are seen and by whom through our practices of taking selfies. This is very important in terms of curation of our self-identity, but also in terms of our self-esteem. You know, we can select who gets to see these images. You know, we can put limits on them, can post on private accounts, for example, on Instagram rather than on public accounts. And we can, you know, generate and develop good practices of self-esteem through our selfie practices as well. Selfies can definitely be empowering as well. The core of empowerment always is the ability to act, and selfies do afford us an ability to act over time. So feeling empowered and being empowered are not always the same thing, but one can argue that selfies are empowering due to the control that we can exert over image creation and sharing. However, these images could be the result of internalizing the norms of the system as well. So it's a difficult argument to sustain that one sometimes, especially if our selfie practices are very much around what we see other people doing. And an interesting aside here, I mean, it's not something I usually would consider here, but one form of visual communication has become very, very popular over the last 12 months is TikTok, right? And a lot of performance on TikTok in particular is around copying the norms of communication on TikTok. You know, we borrow soundtrack off TikTok. You know, we copy dance moves, or we copy particular viral sort of instances and viral forms that we see on TikTok. And so the control aspect there is very, very problematic on TikTok, because what we're actually very often doing as TikTok users is internalizing the norms of that system and of that application itself. I think on other platforms, people can develop and can cultivate their own control mechanisms and sharings, but empowerment can sometimes work in two ways, and it's something you might want to reflect on. Does your use of visual social media actually empower you, or do you often copy things, and is that not so empowering? Or you might want to argue that it is empowering to do that. It's an argument that can be made. So this issue is critically important in understanding the selfie as a form of self-expression, and the reproduction of particular codes in selfies implies that there's not a great deal of empowerment often in selfies. However, the ability to reproduce that code and who to share with and how long, this is where the title of the lecture comes back into play in terms of selfie and society, and how we shape personal identity and so on. So empowerment is a thorny issue, but it is something which I think you should reflect upon. So in conclusion, over these two videos, selfies are a very complex form of visual culture and social media culture used to communicate lots of different meanings. Selfies as a form act in sophisticated ways to aid self-presentation. No two selfies are equal. They are carriers and builders of social capital, and we accrue social capital and we spend social capital in particular ways, and one of the ways we do that is through our presentation of self through selfies. Selfie can be seen as empowering, and selfies are always an act as they're a performance, but selfies are part of a wider culture of visual communication where some representations, especially of women, can be quite problematic. And the control that we are afforded by social media networks and digital media sits in tension with the popular perception of selfies, and of course, going back to last week, the use of selfies as a way for the platform itself to accrue capital, and our selfie posting on social media is always part of social media and the business model of social media, and we should always consider that too. So you're going to have to unpack why you selfie, how you selfie, and for whom you selfie, and for what impact you selfie. And that goes as well if you're analyzing your use of TikTok, for example, or if you're a YouTuber, those are the questions that you're going to have to contend with when you're doing your project, I guess. Hope you guys found this useful. We'll get into it more in the seminar and your selfie practices during that, and your general practices of presentation of self over social media, which is so important to this module. Thanks for listening.